Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Putting aside the Electoral College and the popular vote, a striking fact emerges. 80% of the counties in the U.S. are red counties, each with a highly influential sheriff. These sheriffs, 90% of whom are white and conservative, wield significant power in their jurisdictions. The extent of this influence was starkly illustrated just this past weekend in Portage County, Ohio. There, the sheriff urged residents to collect addresses of homes displaying signs for Vice President Harris, implying that these households might assist in locating an anticipated influx of undocumented immigrants should she win the presidential election. In the complex tapestry of American law enforcement, the office of sheriff stands out as a unique elected position. It exerts enormous influence, not just over our communities and justice system, but increasingly over the electoral process as well. Despite its far-reaching impact, this thread of our democratic fabric has remained largely unexamined, even as it holds tremendous sway over our daily lives. For many of us, our perception of sheriffs has been shaped by classic Western movies, Gary Cooper in High Noon, John Wayne in Rio Bravo. These films painted a romanticized picture of the sheriff as a lone heroic figure standing tall for law and order, or a darker picture of the sheriff as an abusive authority wielding unchecked power for personal gain. Characters like the corrupt sheriff in Unforgiven or the tyrannical Sheriff Cicero in The Quick and the Dead. But as my guest today reveals, the reality of modern sheriffs in small towns or in cities like Los Angeles is a far more complex and potentially troubling story. My guest, Jessica Pishko, has gone deep into this shadowy world. Pishko is a journalist and lawyer and has become the nation's leading authority on sheriffs. In an era when debates about policing and justice reform dominate our national conversation, Pishko's investigation exposes a troubling undercurrent in American democracy. From the rise of what's become known as constitutional sheriffs to their influence on immigration enforcement and election integrity, this often overlooked office has become a flashpoint in our current political landscape. What exactly is the constitutional sheriffs movement, and why is it gaining traction? How have sheriffs aligned themselves with the far-right militia groups, and what are the implications for our communities? And perhaps most crucially, how has the historical role of sheriffs allowed this office to accumulate more power while evading accountability? Jessica Pishko is a journalist and lawyer. She's been reporting on the criminal legal system for a decade with a focus on the political power of sheriffs. It is my pleasure to welcome Jessica Pishko here to the Who, What, Why podcast to talk about the highest law in the land, how the unchecked power of sheriffs threatens democracy. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. Talk a little bit about the historical role of sheriffs, first of all, something that's been with us really since almost the very beginning of the Republic.
It's true. So, when I was researching the book, one of the things I was very curious to find was what was the actual history of sheriff. Most of the sheriff histories that are out there are written by sheriffs themselves. You can find a lot on sheriff websites, and they sort of read a bit like a list of kings, right? They have a list of all the sheriffs that served in the county and their various exploits. It turns out that the history of the sheriff is both a little more nuanced than that, and also, I think, perhaps much more wrapped up in the history of the United States and its history of, racism and colonialism than many people think. The sheriff is an office that came from England. So many people point out it's shire reeve. So, like from the Shire, and the sheriff has always been a local officer. Their main job, to be honest, before the 1800s in the United States was primarily to collect taxes. So, if you've read the stories of Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, he was out there collecting taxes for the good people in order to give them to the king. In the United States, the sheriff pretty quickly became a symbol of Jacksonian democracy. So during the 1800s, there was a push to make many more offices, especially local offices, elected. And one of them was the sheriff. And the idea was to let all white men vote for their local sheriff. And as the United States became larger, part of manifest destiny, taking over vast swaths of territory to the west, the sheriff became more important as a kind of quasi military official. The sheriff has crossed a lot of lines, both as a civil official doing things like still collecting taxes, maintaining property records, also helping people vote. So they were usually in charge of collecting ballots door to door and that sort of thing. And they also began to serve a role both as jailers, so holding people up until the point that they might get picked up. So this was an important role for holding enslaved people who might have escaped, as well as being kind of like a militia force in the West for Anglo settlers who were taking over Native American land. They did a great deal, especially in California, a lot of work quote unquote fighting off Mexicans who were already living in California, and also protecting Anglo settlers from other types of immigrants, especially in the San Francisco area, Chinese immigrant communities who were very large and doing a lot of labor. And that was the role of kind of how the role of sheriffs became something more like police.
Talk a little bit about the nexus between sheriffs and police departments as it's evolved here.
The sheriffs are elected by county, which means that they are tied to the land in a way that police departments aren't. So, police departments are sort of when a place forms a city, they can, if they choose, form a city police department. Now, not all cities can afford to set up their own police department, perhaps because of tax base or other reasons. And so, if you don't have a city police department, you are automatically policed by the sheriff office, which I think is something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but means that in a way, sheriffs are everywhere. They're your default policing. The other thing sheriffs do is that they maintain the jails. So when you have even a city police department, when those police arrest people, they end up bringing them to the jail. And the vast majority of them, around 85% of jails, and in California, every jail is run by sheriffs. So those people that end up getting arrested end up in the custody of the sheriff anyway. So you could think of the sheriff almost as like this funnel where everybody who enters the criminal legal system, in essence, eventually ends up.
One of the other aspects of sheriffs, as I alluded to in the introduction, is there's tremendous mythology that has been built up around them, both good and bad.
That's right. I mean, it's a kind of interesting, right? Because I think when you look at sheriffs, first, a lot of people think of fictional sheriffs is the first thing that comes to mind, right? They think of, as you said, something like John Wayne, or they think of Andy Griffith, right?
Mhm.
The sort of friendly sheriff. And the idea of the sheriff being kind of both really good or really bad has been in the culture a long time. So a character like Wyatt Earp, for example, was both an outlaw and a lawman. And I think even today, if you look at current kind of fictional representations of sheriff, some of them are sort of like the bad guy who does good anyway. So, like the sheriff who doesn't really follow the law, but does enact something that looks like justice. So that can sometimes look good, right? Like sometimes people crave the lawman who doesn't follow like all the technicalities of the law, but ends up like doing the right thing. And then there's also sort of like the sheriff who doesn't follow the technicalities of the law and ends up sort of in self-dealing or corruption, sort of like the sheriff in the Dukes of Hazzard, right? Is the sheriff of like
Right.
the example of the corrupt Southern sheriff.
One of the unique things about sheriffs, and you talk about this, the idea that they're elected locally, that in so many cases they really are reflective of the culture, the local culture of the community in which they serve, more so than police, for example.
Yes, so this is really important to the mythology of the sheriff, the fact that sheriffs are elected and as a result derive their legitimacy from the people. Now, it turns out that that's actually more complicated than it sounds, in part because we know looking at the results of those elections that over 90% of sheriffs are white men. We know that over 90% of the population is not white men. And Second, by looking at the fact that most sheriffs are elected over and over, many serve for decades. Overall, they have much longer terms than chiefs of police. So I think that this points to the fact that while sheriffs claim to derive their legitimacy from these elections, in fact, these elections seem to keep the sheriff sort of stymied in the past and prevent it from, I mean, in essence, prevent it from modernizing and being more representative of the people than perhaps some people think it ought to be.
One of the things that breaks this mythology is that many of the inherent problems with sheriffs and some of the realities we've been talking about are true not just in small towns, but even in communities and counties like Los Angeles.
That's absolutely true. The Los Angeles sheriff, so the recently unelected sheriff, Alex Villanueva, was certainly an example of a sheriff who took the law into his own hands, right? You might think he was a hero, or you might think he was corrupt, depending on your point of view. I think that's absolutely correct. And that's a very large sheriff's office with right millions of dollars, tons of equipment, lots and lots of people in small cities under his direct control. And also to point out incredibly violent. I think it's worth pointing out that we do know that sheriffs and their deputies kill a disproportionate number of people compared to city police.
And why is that? Why do we see so much more violence in sheriff's departments even than in troubled police departments?
Well, I mean, the first day I hesitate to make a strong line that's like police are good and sheriffs are bad. So I want to first say I'm not
Mhm.
trying to advocate for that, right? Like all law enforcement violence is a problem in many places among many types of departments. So I don't want to sort of draw this firm line. I think that what we see in sheriff's offices and the reason why there is a sense of lawlessness, right? We do see both, I think, more corruption, more systemic violence. So like the Los Angeles LASD gangs, that kind of behavior, in addition to sort of what we might call like petty corruption, as well as this violence, comes from the fact that one, because the sheriff is elected, it is difficult for many counties to hold them directly accountable. So, unlike police chiefs who have to report to a city council or mayor, sheriffs report to the county commission, but indirectly, right? They cannot force the sheriff to do something, and it tends to be rather hard to remove sheriffs. I also think that, look, sheriffs get to control a great deal of what they do. They get to control hiring and firing to an extent that police don't. They have control over county jails as well as other civil functions, which makes them give them more power in terms of financial the financial benefits that the sheriff's office gets. And honestly, I also think there's just like kind of a culture of quasi impunity in sheriff's offices. We recently had the sheriff of Riverside County. Well, he said he's running for governor on the GOP ticket, but he also like endorsed Donald Trump for president. And that's normally something I think that we don't expect our policing authorities to do. And so I think there's this idea that like sheriffs are able to do what they want. And that is highly mythologized, right? And kind of admired. And a lot of officials are honestly kind of worried about going against that for fear of backlash. And we see that in Los Angeles, right? When county officials tried to hold Villanueva to account, they were harassed, arrested, and had their home searched. So I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that that would happen.
And talk about this constitutional sheriff's movement. What is that? What does it mean?
The constitutional sheriff movement is a group of currently serving sheriffs that, in essence, believe the sheriff is the highest law in the land, as the title of my book implies. They are directly connected to the far right and kind of the GOP at the moment. And they believe, honestly, quite a lot of what the far right believes, right? They're anti abortion, they're support a lot of ideas of QAnon. And the root of their idea is that the sheriff is the individual who can decide what laws are constitutional and how to enforce those laws. And the way we see that in kind of day to day life for people, for example, might be something like if the sheriff decides that he does not feel like enforcing state gun laws, for example, in California, he might decide that he's going to issue, let's say, concealed carry permits to as many people as he feels like it, or he might issue concealed carry permits to his friends. And in those instances, there might be very little that other citizens can do about it. If the sheriff in your county decides he does not want to enforce red flag laws, for example, which are laws that remove firearms from domestic abusers or other dangerous people, the sheriff will just opt not to remove those firearms. And there might, again, if you are that individual seeking protection, there might be very little that you can do about that. You might not even know that that's what your sheriff is doing.
And we have seen further and further alignment with a lot of sheriffs with far right militia groups. Talk about that.
So there is a kind of direct link between far right sheriffs and militia groups. Much of it comes from a shared history and this, what I would call worship of firearms, right? This is a very important factor to militia groups. The idea that people can own firearms and whatever firearms they want. And the same ideas of constitutional sheriffs, this value and I think really like worship of firearms. And for both groups, the idea becomes, in essence, like the person who has the most firepower is the person who gets to define liberty. And indeed, one of the important things I think about constitutional sheriffs is not just that they're in places like Nevada or Arizona or Louisiana, places where I think people already think like the state is rather conservative. But again, states like California, states like New York, places that are run by Democrats, and yet you have these sheriffs who are very important locally because they support these far right fringe elements in their county. And they provide a lot of important support and legitimacy to these militias who honestly, that when they know the sheriff supports them, that makes it easier for them to go into the streets and have open carry demonstrations or protest Black Lives Matter or whatever it is that these militia groups feel like they need to do.
Are there fundamental cultural differences in regions in the country? And we look at Southern sheriffs a certain way, sheriffs in the West a certain way, in the East. Talk about that.
There are important cultural differences in how sheriffs, in essence, came about in their role. Um, this really, and again, this comes from like just the great diversity of land in the United States. In the West, there are very large counties, vast swaths of land, and also a lot of land that's owned by the federal government. And because of that, the sheriff there, I think, especially far right and constitutional sheriffs, have represented a lot of libertarian values. So the idea of private land ownership, fights against federal ownership of land, the desire to own firearms, and this what I paint as like a quasi military quality. California, when the state was first formed, policing was done by what they called vigilance committees. So a group of people would get together in the local saloon and decide what people needed punishing, like what horse thieves or whatever people were the out group at the moment needed punishing. And then the sheriff would collect a posse, go out and take care of those people they thought were a problem. This was immensely popular in the West. In the East, we have a lot more smaller towns. Sheriffs kind of serve roles alongside a lot of constables and other kind of local policing. So, in some ways, the role of the sheriff was not as great in terms of policing, and sheriffs have more importance there in running jails. And in the South, of course, we have this idea of like the racist Southern sheriff, right? The sheriff who runs their jail, who enforces Jim Crow. And again, a lot of this is true. Sheriffs were extremely important in the South in enforcing Jim Crow laws and maintaining segregation and in preventing Black people from voting.
We have seen of late a lot of involvement of sheriffs with respect to immigration. What's happening there?
Sheriffs have long been involved in immigration in the past few decades, but this was not something I think that was originally intended, but they have taken over a lot of immigration enforcement. Some of this is because sheriffs run jails, and jails are an important contact point for everybody, as I mentioned, who enters the criminal legal system. When people enter jails, they are automatically checked to see if they are in some sort of database. They check, look to see if you have like previous warrants or other issues. And one of the things they will look to see is whether they're either you have been previously deported or if there is a concern with your immigration status. In some jails, sheriffs voluntarily agree to do more immigration enforcement, so they might ask people or do further investigations into people's immigration status. And then alongside that, sheriffs can hold people and then send them directly to ICE. The other thing sheriffs have been doing with the support of the federal government is more policing on the border, especially the US Mexico border, although also the US Canada border. And they receive funding from the federal government. It's a program called Operation Stone Garden that, in essence, gives money to border sheriffs, even non border sheriffs, actually. You don't have to be directly on the border to get this funding, and it allows sheriffs to do what they call sort of joint missions with Border Patrol. And this is because, quite honestly, Border Patrol just doesn't have enough manpower to do all of the policing that it might like to do. And so sheriffs tend to provide this extra manpower to help police and patrol parts of the US Mexico border in particular.
Talk a little bit about how these sheriffs that in many cases, as you've talked about, see themselves as pretty unaccountable, think that they derive this power, that they derive this constitutional power. Where does that come from?
In my book and in researching my book, one of the things I argue is that the constitutional sheriff movement really comes from like the history of sheriffs generally. The constitutional sheriff movement, while not large, has had great success in presenting sheriffs an idea of their own power. The constitutional sheriff movement has emphasized that sheriffs are and can indeed do what they want, that they are a populist form of law enforcement. And they see that reflected in what they do, right? Every time Alex Villanueva did something and was not stopped, right? I mean, often he did things and no one did stop him. Sheriffs see that and think, oh, well, that's a really good idea. I think I have that power too, right? And then it becomes reflected in their day to day actions, particularly in their resistance to very normal and typical types of police reform. So, an example is something like setting up civilian oversight. In California, there is a specific law that says that sheriffs can be subject to civilian oversight in every county. But we saw sheriffs really resist that, right? They consistently say, I don't need oversight, or they sued over the law. Oh, you can't have oversight over us, right? And I sometimes think that this is like one of the greatest achievements of the constitutional sheriff movement is to give every sheriff the confidence to say with certainty that they are the highest law, that people cannot make laws that regulate them. This is not true, of course, but it gives them this perception. And for a lot of people, it may or may not be worth their time to counter that perception.
We saw a lot of activity on the part of sheriffs during the pandemic when it related to things like mask mandates and vaccine mandates. Talk about that.
So during COVID in 2020, this became a great recruiting tool for the far right sheriff movement and for sheriffs generally, because they suddenly found themselves with what they felt like was the power to say that they wouldn't enforce mask mandates or business closures. With kind of an unusual instance in which sheriffs were able to rise to the fore as kind of the officials most tasked with these health measures. It's sort of unusual and interesting that sheriffs would be tasked with this. Um, in part, it's because as county officials, that was part of their role. And in part, it's because in some counties in California, sheriffs also serve as coroners. So you also had a large number of sheriff coroners who were spreading misinformation about vaccines and uh, various COVID deaths. And so there was this sort of combined role in which sheriffs were suddenly serving as both political figures and quasi health officials, in which they could both spread misinformation about COVID and vaccines and also claim that they weren't going to enforce these various health measures.
What role do sheriffs play in elections?
So, under normal circumstances, sheriffs don't play any role in
Right.
elections. They sometimes serve as law enforcement, and the most common thing that sheriffs might be called to do is, let's say you have an unruly individual at a polling place. You might call the sheriff or other local police to like tell that person to calm down or arrest them if they're committing a crime. That is when I looked at like when people call law enforcement, that is the most common thing, right? And that makes sense. What has happened is that as elections and this issue of election fraud has become more popular on the far right, many sheriffs have started to claim more authority over election investigations than they have. They have started to claim that they not only have authority to, generally keep the peace, prevent people from being harassed, but also to serve as some kind of like election police. So ensuring that ballots are cast properly, policing ballots, taking it upon themselves to self police various types of voting procedures, especially early voting or drop boxes. This is all kind of a myth of the far right sheriff movement, but sheriffs have eagerly taken this on. For many of them, again, similar to the ways in which sheriffs were able to make bold claims during the COVID pandemic, because this is a popular issue on the far right. It's something that a lot of voters care about, especially in more conservative places. And so sheriffs have kind of eagerly taken on the idea that, oh, sure, I can police elections too. Again, the issue with something like a sheriff's office that is so flexible and has so much general power is there's not a whole lot to keep them from taking on more power if they like it, like a mission creep, right? If they're already doing all these other things, then why shouldn't they be policing elections too? A lot of it is, again, just purely political. But it is something that I think is worrisome and dangerous to people because they may believe that their sheriffs have authority. A lot of far right groups are doing vigilante voter policing, and they tend to go to their sheriff as the most sympathetic individual.
One of the things we've seen with respect to incarceration is that more and more of their jails become profit centers for their community, for their county, and this creates a whole different set of incentives in terms of incarceration.
Yes. So jails have become great sites of lots and lots of people. And we've seen in many states, as they have tried to decrease their prison population, that jails have instead become extremely full and overcrowded. As a result, sheriffs have used that as an opportunity to both build bigger jails. And as they say, if you build it, they will fill it. So they build bigger jails with the idea that they will either fill it with more people or fill it by renting out the space. So in many states, they can rent the space either to the state to hold people who might otherwise be in state prison, or they can rent that out to the federal government and hold either people who are in immigration detention or people who are being held by the U.S. Marshals for various reasons. And so when they do this, they make money. In some places, sheriffs can also charge a per diem. So they essentially charge like a hotel, like if you stayed in a hotel, they charge a like per diem to people who stay in the jail. In some jails, sheriffs charge people a per diem to have like an upgraded jail stay. So like if you want your Marriott rewards or whatever, you pay like you pay more money to the sheriff to have like a nicer jail cell. And this is the way that sheriffs honestly they kind of make money via the jail. It gives them quite a lot of power. It makes them also like profit centers in the county, right? For many counties that might be cash strapped, the fact that the sheriff can fund his own department and fund his own jail through like charging these kind of per diem amounts is something that makes the sheriff really appealing. It also adds to the power of the sheriff and it also disincentivizes county officials from getting in the sheriff's way.
The other thing that it does is it allows them carte blanche in terms of abuses at some of these jails, as we have seen from one end of the country to the other.
That's correct. I mean, at this point, I think that county jails are among the most dangerous places for people to be. We know that people go into them extremely distressed and that people die at very high rates. And quite frankly, jails are where people go because they are in distress. When you get arrested, you don't get asked for your medical history. You can't go home and get your medicine if you're a diabetic. And a lot of people do go into jail. They may or may not have substance use issues and they might have other medical problems. And there are unfortunate stories across the country of people dying, giving birth on jail cell floors, people going into withdrawal. people having problems because they don't have their like insulin or other medications that they require, and people in mental health emergencies. Like jails are truly becoming this place that are very, very dangerous. And quite frankly, sheriffs are just not the people most equipped to handle it. In one county, I think Fresno County in California, they asked, reporters asked the sheriff about why people were dying in the jails. And she just said, well, that happens. People will die. It's sort of accepted as something that happens. And I think, in particular, sheriffs as law enforcement have a really gimlet eye towards people suffering in jail. They don't take their complaints particularly seriously. And again, sheriffs don't have training in medicine. They don't have training in sort of maintaining hospital like conditions or even, management. And so you have these sites of great people in great distress that are run by kind of unqualified law enforcement
Well,
officials.
one of the things about it is how accepted it is. I mean, it's no surprise to anybody that follows this, even in a tertiary way, that places like Fulton County Jail, Cook County Jail, LA County Jail, that these are such dangerous places, and yet nothing ever gets done about it.
Yes, it is. I mean, I agree. They are extremely dangerous. I think, for one thing, because the sheriff controls the jail, they also control the flow of information into and out of the jail. So, in the first instance, it can be very hard to get that information. In the second instance, as we pointed out, it is very hard to get sheriffs to force sheriffs to change, right? Because they are an elected office. It can be hard to force them to change their jails and the way they run their jails. And I think, unfortunately, the view of jails among many people is that the individuals in jail somehow deserve to be there. And to that, I will point out, jail is a place where you go if you're arrested. A lot of people have not been tried. They have not been found guilty yet. And a lot of people are in jail, quite frankly, because they can't afford cash bail, because they are unlucky. Um, and many of them who are serving perhaps time in jail, they are serving time for misdemeanors and other non-violent felonies. And so they really are not, there are people that maybe shouldn't be there and that are grossly taken advantage of by sheriffs who, I mean, ultimately are kind of using their jails as a form of profit, as a way to enhance their uh, position within the county, right? Jails are also immensely, there's a lot of contracts in jails, right? You pay for medical care, for linen, for construction, for building maintenance, for HVAC. There's so many contracts that the sheriff can dole out from the jail, and the sheriff kind of has complete control over how these jails are run. Everything from whether people are permitted to visit their kids or whether they're required to use video visits. So the sheriff decides if you can hug your children while you're in jail, to whether you are searched, what kind of searches you have to endure when you're in jail, what kind of health care, and for example, whether you can go to the hospital if you're in jail. That's all decided by the sheriff.
Is there any kind of movement, any kind of serious push for reform in a broad sense to the power that these sheriffs have gained from coast to coast?
I think that what we've seen is that the desire to reform policing has trickled down to sheriffs. We have seen across the country, for example, a move to change the office of sheriff through election, for example. So we have seen in places like Los Angeles where, there was a move to vote out the county sheriff who seemed to be abusing his power. This has happened across the country. And I also think there's been a push to impose what I would consider basic law enforcement reforms, like civilian oversight on sheriff's offices. I do think that one of the issues has been that some of these reforms have proven not as successful as people have hoped. So, for example, voting in a new sheriff, while it does certainly change policies right away, in many places, when you vote in a new sheriff, they can't just fire everyone in the office. It is hard to make change. And we have seen also that sheriff's offices and the people in them are very resistant to change. I mean, policing overall is resistant to change, and sheriff's offices even more so. So I think that that's been it's been a really difficult road for reform. We're kind of in this moment where police reform is stagnating to some extent. And we really see that reflected in sheriff's offices, particularly in places where people are far to the right and they really see their sheriff's office as like a way for them to assert power, especially in states that are run by Democrats. There's this movement locally in a lot of rural areas that look to their sheriff as sort of the politician most likely to support far right politics.
Have we seen sheriff's departments, large and small, gain more and more power as the country has become more polarized?
In my view, yes. So I think some of this is part of the spread of the constitutional sheriff movement, which has empowered sheriffs to believe that they have more power. One of the things that the constitutional sheriff movement has done throughout the country is they sort of go on the road and have something like a traveling tent revivals in which they invite sheriffs and sheriff supporters to come to these various trainings and, quote unquote, teach them how to be better constitutional sheriffs. These have been pretty successful in rural counties, often because, one, to be honest, trainings for sheriffs are pretty poor in most states, right? They don't have actually robust training. And as already pointed out, in most states, there's almost no requirement to be sheriff. So you do have a group of untrained elected officials who, right, crave information. And then they get this information, like how to support the Constitution, which sounds good to most of them. The second thing is that because sheriffs are on the county level, a lot of these sheriffs are in places with low population. So, right, a sheriff could be, you're a sheriff in a county of 2 billion people, or you're a sheriff in a county of like 200, and all of them get elected sheriff equally. So it creates something like the electoral college, a kind of reinforcement of like rural power. So when you think about it, some 80% of counties in the United States voted for Trump. That's not 80% of the population, but that means about 80% of sheriffs in the country are in counties where most of the people supported Trump. So that means you have a lot of sheriffs in places that are pretty far to the right. And even when those sheriffs may not come into office that way, they have people in their counties that are pushing them to support far right policies. So one of the things you see over and over and over is like militia groups or other far right groups pushing their county sheriff to support these policies, right? To like host militias, host various constitutional sheriff groups, say that they believe in far right ideas, say that they'll do election policing. This is like something that happens on the local level, again, because these sheriffs are very accessible local officials in a lot of rural places.
Jessica Pishko, her book is The Highest Law in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Jessica, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.